Bebop, but then without the scales. What makes a great bebop line is the flow in the melody that keeps it moving forward, syncopated rhythms, and also that it's not too predictable or boring. It should surprise you as well. But usually when we talk about playing bebop, then it quickly just becomes about scales, and that's not the only way to go about it, and probably also not the easiest way to get the right type of sound into your solos. Let me show you what I mean with this George Benson lick, where the line on the 2 chord is put together in a really clever way. The trick is to not think about scales with lots of notes, but instead use basic chord tones, in this case the G minor triad, and then create a line by using melodies that just naturally have that forward motion or flow that you want in there. That makes your solo have energy and momentum, and as you'll see later, it actually also helps you add some more interesting rhythms to your lines. This George Benson lick is really just a series of short melodies that create tension and resolve to the basic chord tones. First the 3rd, then the 5th, and then the root, before adding 2 notes to take us to the next chord, C7. So what you need to create lines like this is a vocabulary of short melodies that resolve to the chord tones of the chord that you're soloing on. And you have an exercise for that, and there's a good chance that you already know this exercise. You just never realized just how powerful it actually is. Let's take a D minor triad. And then you have this exercise where you add an enclosure around each note in that chord. To me, this always seemed an incredibly basic and actually pretty boring sounding exercise, but you can make some pretty amazing lines with some really simple tools, as you will hear throughout this video. First, let's just go over one variation of the exercise that is good to also check out. Turn around the enclosures. I'll show you how important that is later in the video. Just playing the exercise is not going to sound very inspiring. It quickly becomes boring and predictable, but that doesn't mean that we can't get some great lines out of this approach. And here the melody on the D minor 7 chord is using the basic triad notes A, F, D and A, really just a descending D minor triad, but then adding the enclosure before the F, and also adding an enclosure that takes us to B, so the 3rd of G7, and that way really helping with driving the solo line forward and keeping things moving to the next chord. As you'll see then, this approach to making lines can solve 3 common problems that beginners have with bebop lines. This first one was just adding direction to the melody so that you're not just playing notes on one chord and then some other notes on the next chord. But there are 2 other things that are a lot easier to get right with this approach. The previous example only used the enclosures, but you can of course also just add a single chromatic leading note before a chord tone. For a G7, then that will give you this type of sound. And that is something that you can easily use in a line, and actually there is another bonus feature with this approach, which I'll show you as well. In this example, you have 2 places with a chromatic leading note. You have G sharp into A on the D minor 7 and also C sharp into D on the G7. You could also see the D sharp resolving to E as a leading note, but here it could also be heard as an enclosure with F and D sharp resolving to the 3rd of C major 7. A problem that you often run into with scale-based soloing is that everything is just running up and down the scale, and if you try to add large intervals to the melody, then they sound strange and unmelodic. But if the melody is constructed of chord tones by adding phrases that resolve to those chord tones, then it's actually a lot easier to skip around and still get it to make sense as a melody. In the example, you saw that on the D minor 7 there is a skip down to the 5th with a leading note. And the same type of melody on the G7. So when you're constructing the melody by putting together shorter melodies resolving to chord tones, you have a much stronger method for adding melodic interval skips to your solo, and that makes the lines sound a lot more interesting. And that's also why I mentioned that it was really important that you check out the basic triad exercise with the turned around enclosures, because using the enclosures like that is actually going to help you create some interesting interval skips and make your lines sound much more alive. So if we take the first example, really what's happening here is that I'm starting on the 5th and then going down to the 3rd, but then adding an enclosure around that 3rd. So the way I do it in the line, I'm going from A and then I'm doing the enclosure, but moving up in the enclosure. So I'm going all the way down to E and then to F. And that's helping me change direction in the melody and skip from A down to E in a way that actually makes sense. And if I did it the other way around, then the line would be a lot less interesting, because then you would just have... When you're playing lines trying to nail the changes, then you have to watch out that you don't end up with heavy, uninspired lines like this. You need to have more interesting rhythms happening, not just run up and down the scale from heavy beat to heavy beat. Something like this works a lot better. And what makes the rhythm stand out here is that the melody is put together from groups of notes that make sense for the chord, but are not always falling or ending on the heavy beat. The F stands alone, followed by a descending D minor triad with an enclosure around the first note, then another enclosure taking you to G7, and a melody resolving to C major 7 on the forehand. So really anticipating and avoiding the heavy downbeat. Closing the phrase, you have a melody that you can either see as based on a C major triad with an enclosure, or a superimposed G major triad. So working like this opens up how the rhythm of the melody flows and helps you hear melodies that are not only tied to beat 1 and beat 3, and it helps you make your solo sound a lot lighter and a lot more interesting. When you're working on getting better lines into your solos, then it can be really useful to work on learning some new building blocks and start adding those to your vocabulary. You want to have short, flexible melodies that you can use with this. So check out this video with 7 4-note bebop building blocks that you can add to your solos. Because if you have short building blocks, then you can really put them together, create your own lines and get your own sound, but still sound like bebop.